colleagues and all of our witnesses for joining us at the first subcommittee hearing of the new Congress, and it is called the Federal Debt Limit and Its Economic Consequences. Very timely. The debt limit is the total amount of money that the United States government can borrow to pay for spending that Congress is already committed to. The debt limit will not authorize new spending, but failing to increase it when needed would cause the U.S. government to default on its obligations, plunging our economy into crisis and pushing millions of Americans out of their jobs. Last month, the Treasury Department announced that the federal government will hit the default point as early as June. Now, House Republicans don't seem concerned about the upcoming debt limit deadline. Instead, they seem downright thrilled to have an opportunity to use it as leverage to demand tax cuts for billionaires and giant corporations. And instead of taxing the wealthiest Americans, these House Republicans want to shove the burden off on hardworking Americans with a massive new national sales tax, or by imposing dramatic cuts on Medicare, Social Security, and other government programs that support middle-class families. Today, a new report from Moody's shows that House Republicans are trying to wedge the economy and American workers between a rock and a hard place. Now, here's the rock. They won't raise the debt ceiling, and if they don't, House Republicans will plunge the U.S. economy into a recession and cost at least 1 million Americans their jobs. And here's the hard place. If they raise the debt ceiling, but only in return for sharp spending cuts, they will also trigger a recession and push 2.6 million Americans out of work. Dr. Mark Zandi, one of the authors of this report, is joining us to explain these findings in more detail. Now, House Republicans have said right out loud that they are looking for big spending cuts. Ways and Means Chair Jason Smith bragged that he would use the debt ceiling, quote, to right-size the federal government. Representative Buddy Carter said, quote, our main focus has got to be on entitlements. Representative Ralph Norman promised cuts that will, quote, shock people. And Kevin McCarthy committed not to raise the debt ceiling without securing massive spending cuts and no tax increases in order to bribe extremist House Republicans into letting him be Speaker. But let's be clear about what the debt ceiling is. It doesn't prevent new spending. It doesn't bring back any of the trillions of dollars that went out the door with the Trump tax cuts. All it does is prevent us from paying the bills that we've already run up. Congress should extend the debt ceiling immediately as part of doing our jobs, the same way the Republicans did 3 times when Donald Trump was president. Increasing the debt ceiling wouldn't increase the deficit or cause any new spending or have any negative effects at all. But extremist Republicans are insisting on new massive spending cuts that will fall almost entirely on middle-class families. Really, Republicans are working hard to wreck the Biden economy. Now, there are a number of Republicans who insist that they will not extend the debt ceiling, period. What would that mean? According to this new analysis from Moody's, a very short breach would plunge the economy into a recession and cause the loss of 1 million jobs. A longer version of breach would cost as much as 7 million jobs. Breaching the debt ceiling would be a disaster. But the Moody's data show that caving in to House Republican cuts would also inflict terrible damage on our economy and put millions of people out of work. Republican House leaders have suggested an immediate 10% real cut in federal spending, and then cutting spending by 26% over the next decade. That would mean massive cuts to programs that Americans care about, programs in education, housing, childcare, emergency response to hurricanes and floods, food inspection, air traffic control, medical research, fighting counterfeiters and drug traffickers, delivering the mail, monitoring air pollution, inspecting sewage treatment, fighting wildfires, keeping highways and bridges repaired. It is a long list that House Republicans are willing to slash. In the short term, these extreme cuts would drive the U.S. economy into a recession and force 2.6 million Americans out of their jobs. A decade from now, we would still be short 1 million jobs and 2.8% of our GDP, as if our economy had simply stood still for a full year. I'll say it again. Debt ceiling breach is bad for our economy, but House Republican spending cuts are also a disaster, plunging our economy into a recession and putting more than 2.5 million people out of work. I appreciate that Anat Weissenfreund, did I get it right? Good. From my home state of Massachusetts is here today to help us understand the real-life impacts of these Republican plans. Now, it is impossible to take House Republicans' claims to want to reduce the deficit seriously. Their proposals simply seem designed to cause pain. Now, there's a debate among economists about how important deficit reduction really is. But if we want to have a serious conversation about deficit reduction, it starts with the trillions of dollars, that's trillions with a T, that we could raise with a few simple steps that would leave middle-class families untouched. Repeal the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations. Tax giant multinationals on their offshore profits. Strengthen the billionaire corporate minimum tax. Raise the tax on stock buybacks. And make sure that billionaires pay taxes on their growing piles of wealth. Eventually, we must raise the debt ceiling and pay what we owe. That leaves our country with two options to deal with the national debt. We can raise trillions of dollars in new revenue without touching middle-class families, or we can cave into Republican blackmail, wreck our economy, cut Medicare and Social Security, and cripple government programs that create jobs and invest in the middle class. Today, I sent President Biden a letter urging him to put out a strong budget later this week that raises revenues from the wealthy and well-connected and rejects extremist, job-destroying House Republican plans. Our choice could not be simpler, and that is what we are here today to talk about. And now I will turn this over to Ranking Member Senator Kennedy for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank Senator Warren for calling this hearing. I want to thank all of you for being here. I know you're busy. We have several things going on this afternoon, so I may be in and out, but I want to stay as long as I can to hear your testimony. Let me make a couple of points. Number one, it is unthinkable to me that the United States Congress will not extend the debt limit. I can tell you the United States, this United States senator will not vote to halt on America's debt. Now, we have a lot of it, but there's a moral principle involved and a practical principle involved. And if you're going to have a party, you got to pay the band. And it's time for us to pay the band, and we're going to do it. However, I think you will see some of us, including but not limited to the House Republicans, use this as an opportunity to talk about our rate of growth in spending and to talk about the rate of growth in our debt accumulation. And that's not unusual. Every time we have one of these disagreements in divided government over the debt ceiling and extending it, A, the debt ceiling's always extended, and B, there are always negotiations. So why is it important for the president and the Congress to sit down and talk about it? Well, a couple of reasons. I think many economists today are Keynesians, And as we all know, Dr. Keynes talked about the importance of deficit spending in government when you're in a recession, like the recession we had during the pandemic. The importance of government deficit spending to stimulate the economy, and it works. But some economists leave out the second part of what Dr. Keynes said. He said, when the recession's over, you pay the money back. And that's kind of an important part of the equation. So that's point two. Point three, why is it important that we have this discussion? The chair and I had a hearing this morning, and other senators with Chairman Jay Powell. And he's being cast to be very careful in his answers. I understand that. But here, in my opinion, is what's going on at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is raising the federal funds rate. Why is it doing that? It's trying to slow the economy. What does that mean? Well, it means the Fed is trying to lower GDP. But how do you measure that? How do you measure success in cooling the economy? Chairman Powell wants to talk about the nexus between supply and demand. I understand why he talks like that, but here's what's going on. You measure you measure the effect of interest rates and rising interest rates and unemployment. Okay, that's what it means when you cool the economy. The job of the Fed to curtail inflation is to put people out of work. That's its job. And I am convinced that the Federal Reserve is going to do that. Now, Chairman Powell is not trying to reduce prices. We're going to live with these new high prices a long time. He's trying to achieve disinflation, which means a reduction in the rate of growth of inflation. Since the 1950s, we've had 10 periods where we had to work for disinflation. We had inflation was too high, we wanted to get it down. In every instance where we were able to achieve disinflation, we did it by raising unemployment. And the average over a 50-year period, to reduce inflation by 2%, you had to increase unemployment by 3.6%. Now, today, inflation is 6.4%. The unemployment rate is, 3.4%. So, based on history, in order to get inflation down to 2%, you can do the math. Chairman Powell, if he acts on his own, just using monetary policy, will have to raise rates to 10.6%. And that's going to put a lot of people out of the work. I believe, and I think history demonstrates this as well, that I know we can put fewer people out of work if Congress works with Chairman Powell on the fiscal side. Powell's in charge of monetary policy. Congress is in charge of fiscal policy. And I believe, as much as I'm sitting here, that if we can slow the rate of growth in spending and debt accumulation to stimulate the economy less, that's going to save a lot of people's jobs. And I guess the final point I'd make, Madam Chair, I don't believe this Federal Reserve is going to go down in history as the Federal Reserve that let inflation beat them. I don't. I think Chairman Powell is serious as 4 heart attacks and a stroke. And if he's got to raise those rates to 10.6%, he denies he might have to go that high, but history's not in his favor. He's going to do it. And that's going to hurt millions of Americans, as the chairwoman said, put people out of work. Congress can save a lot of those jobs if we act on the fiscal side. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. I appreciate those comments. So we have a great set of witnesses today to be able to discuss these issues. They're going to share their views on the consequences of gambling with the debt ceiling and with American jobs. First, we have Dr. Mark Zandi, who is the chief economist at Moody's Analytics. Dr. Zandi is a leading authority on economics and data analysis, and he has extensive expertise in the issues we're discussing today, and of course, the new report out today. Second, we will have Ms. Anat Weissenfreud. Did I get it right this time? Again? Both times. I'm 2 for 2. I love it. I really appreciate your being here. She is the director of Head Start and Early Learning Programs at the Community Action Pioneer Valley in Franklin County and Hampshire County in my home state of Massachusetts. Ms. Weissenfreud helps make sure that kids and families in the Pioneer Valley can get the quality of childcare and early education services they need. She's going to remind us when we're talking graphs and charts about what that means on the ground for real people, including a lot of really small people. So thank you, and thank you for the work you do. Third, we have Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum, which provides analysis on economic, domestic, and fiscal policy issues, longtime expert and testifies many times before Congress. Thank you for being with us. Fourth, we have Dr. Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he oversees the Institute's work on economic policy issues. And finally, we have Ms. Amy Matsui, who is Director of Income Security and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center. Ms. Matsui has spent years fighting on behalf of low and middle income women and families and advocating for a tax code that works not just for a handful at the top, but that works for everyone. So thank you all for being with us today, and I'm going to start with you. Dr. Zandi,
Thank you.
Recognize you for 5 minutes, and of course you can put all of your remarks in the record if you wish.
Thank you so much, Senator, and I want to thank you and Senator Kennedy for the opportunity to be here today. I should say that my comments are my own and not that of the Moody's Corporation. And just for sake of disclosure, I'm on the board of directors of MGIC. It's a publicly traded mortgage insurer, and on the board of the Coleridge Initiative, which is a nonprofit that works to facilitate the use of government data in public policy. I'll make 3 points in my opening remarks. First, I think it's absolutely critical that lawmakers either increase, suspend, or preferably do away with the debt limit. If we don't do away with it within the next few months, the Treasury will run out of cash to pay all of the government's bills. In fact, we've done a bit of work trying to estimate the so-called X date when the Treasury will run out of cash, and we put that at August 18th. So that gives you about 6 months to get something across the finish line. If the legislation isn't passed and there's a breach of the debt limit, I think obviously that would be chaotic for financial markets, the stock market, the bond market, foreign exchange markets, and would push us into a recession of one form or another, depending on the circumstances. And I would say, even the longer this discussion goes on, the more damage it's going to do to this economy. You go back and look at previous debt limit battles, like the 2011 battle that was pretty debilitating, significantly undermined investor, consumer, and business confidence. And in this fragile economy, because of the high inflation, high interest rates, and recession risks that Senator Kennedy mentioned, that would be particularly inopportune. So point number one is it just makes no sense not to increase this or suspend or do away with the debt limit in a timely way. Second point is there's no way around this. There's been a lot of discussion about, well, is there a workaround? And a fair amount of the debate and discussions have been around payment prioritization, the idea of paying bondholders, treasury bondholders, and then not paying everyone else on time. The thought being that that would mean that we're not defaulting on the government debt. And maybe in a technical sense, we're not defaulting on the government debt, but I'm not sure how long that would last in a political sense. And I think investors know this very clearly. If I'm a Japanese investor, a Chinese investor, a Saudi investor, a British investor, I know it's it's not going to be very long before before I don't get my bill, because there's no way that an 85-year-old Social Security recipient or someone in the military or even the electric bill for a federal government building in Omaha, Nebraska doesn't get paid before I get paid. And so that would not forestall, payment prioritization would not forestall that chaos in the financial system and the resulting recession that would occur. Other ideas like a platinum coin, issuing a lot of premium bonds, 14th Amendment, all not viable options. There's only one solution here, and that is to increase, suspend, or eliminate the debt limit by mid-August. The final point is I think the debt limit should be increased without strings, no strings. Clean debt limit legislation, meaning no additional policy needed. I think the deficits and debt load that we struggle with today are bipartisan. I think both parties have contributed. You can just look at recent history. The $3 trillion in government support that was provided during the teeth of the pandemic in 2020, both parties agreed to that. The American Rescue Plan that was passed early in the Biden administration in 2021, only Democrats voted for that. That added $2 trillion to future budget deficits. But of course, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was passed back in 2017-18, that was only supported by Republicans, added $2 trillion to the deficit. So this is ecumenical politically. Both sides, play a role in this. And not paying on the bills will only make the nation's fiscal situation meaningfully worse. It will just add to the interest, add to the compensation that investors are going to demand because of the risk that they face that they won't get paid in the future. It's incumbent on lawmakers to put an end to this once and for all and increase the debt limit. Let's move on. I will say one final thing, and that is I do believe that our nation's fiscal situation does deserve careful attention. Our deficits and debt, long run, are going to be a problem, and I do think that does require, a look at both tax revenue and spending restraint. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zandy. Ms. Weissenfreud.
Chair Warren, Ranking Member Kennedy, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Anat Weissenfreund, as you said, and I'm the Director of Head Start and Early Learning Programs at Community Action Pioneer Valley in Western Massachusetts. I'm also the President of the Massachusetts Association for Infant Mental Health, and for the past 30 years, I've worked to support the youngest children and their families in various clinical and leadership roles. I'm here to speak to you today about the immense benefits Head Start brings, the current funding challenges we face, and the significant impact of potential future funding cuts to our program. For nearly 6 decades, Head Start has provided critical services for pregnant women, infants, toddlers, preschoolers, and their families in communities across our country, prioritizing those with the lowest incomes and living in the most difficult circumstances. It is well known that poverty in its multiple forms puts the youngest children and their families at risk. The discoveries of brain and developmental science leave no doubt. Our experiences in the first 5 years of life will impact our entire lives. Head Start is grounded in this knowledge, and our work supports the needs of children, their families, and their earliest relationships. Our programs provide high-quality early education to support children's school readiness. Nutritious snacks, meals, transportation make that possible. We screen children to ensure healthy development. We connect them to needed services. At the same time, we work with families to become increasingly self-sufficient and confident in their parenting abilities. We provide crisis intervention, housing assistance, access to education, job training programs, and so much more. The long-term positive impact of Head Start for children, families, and future generations is well documented. The program I lead has provided Head Start and childcare since 1966. Our Western Massachusetts service area spans nearly 1,600 square miles and includes 3 mostly rural and semi-rural counties from the border of Vermont to the border of Connecticut. We're funded to serve 120 infants and toddlers and 318 preschool children, and do so in a variety of program models. We braid federal Head Start funds with Massachusetts child care funds to provide eligible children with full-day, full-year care so that their parents can work. In the 21-22 program year, 55% of our Head Start children received a child care subsidy, and over 70% of the families we serve are working in job training or school. When fully staffed, we employ 168 people as educators, family service workers, bus drivers, cooks, janitors, nurses, and more. In rural Western Massachusetts, we are a major provider of early education, but also a major employer. All we do is made possible by our dedicated and skilled staff, yet, as a direct result of decades of insufficient funding, recruiting and retaining qualified professionals is a chronic challenge. The last years of the pandemic, coupled with rising inflation, have made a bad situation worse. In our program, 75% of the budget goes to salary and fringe, yet classroom teachers earn an average of only $37,000 annually, about half that of their counterparts in public schools. In the 21-22 school year, out of 51 educator positions, 37% left during the course of the year, and as of mid-August 22, 33% of these positions were still vacant. All across the nation, staff are leaving their jobs in droves for higher paying and less demanding opportunities, and low salaries are a main barrier to talented early childhood professionals wishing to enter the field. Clearly, staff vacancies directly impact our ability to serve children and families, and for children who may have already suffered multiple breaks in attachment in their young lives, sudden and repeated loss of their teachers is especially damaging. In my career, I have never experienced a situation more severe than the workforce crisis we're facing now. Even modest reductions in funding would be devastating to those who rely on Head Start, setting back measurable national gains in school readiness and undercutting communities just beginning to rebound from the pandemic. So, Chair Warren, Ranking Member Kennedy, members of the committee, we rely on your unwavering commitment. Please ensure that we have sufficient funds to continue Head Start's most important work. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to serve as a resource on the committee on these important issues and would be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you very much. I have to go vote, so I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Kennedy, and I will be right back. My apologies, but I will catch up. Thank you. Senator Kennedy?
Chair Warren, as you exit, Ranking Member Kennedy,
See you again.
good to see you again. I'm going to tell you some things you've already heard or even said briefly, and then look forward to a chance to answer your questions. First and foremost, Congress must raise or suspend the debt limit as expeditiously as possible in any way possible. Strings, no strings, I don't think that matters. Second point is failure to do so raises a long list of risks. Even tiptoeing up to what Dr. Zandi called the X date was going to produce investor drops in confidence. You're going to see financial market instability. You're going to see some spreads rise on treasuries, and it's going to be an economic headwind that we don't need, but we'll get it. Continuing down that path would lead to a default, would lead to a downgrade of U.S. treasuries, a loss of their risk-free nature. That would be a recipe for global financial turmoil, and we would have poor economic performance across the globe with fallout on every American. It's inescapable and is simply a self-inflicted wound that no one needs. The third point is that the chair was correct when she said that failure to raise the debt limit is not fiscal sobriety. These are disconnected. Our fiscal trajectory is very important, but raising the debt limit is about our past, decisions we've made in the past on spending and taxes. That bill has to be paid, be it a band or otherwise, and raising the debt limit is about that past. I want to echo those who pointed out that the U.S. is on a long-term federal budget outlook that's unsustainable. The CBO recently put out its long-term budget outlook. It's the same outlook I put out in 2003 when I was the CBO director. In the 21st century, Congresses and administrations have not been serious about taking on the federal budget problems that we face. The clock has been ticking for 2 decades and we're running out of time. I urge Congress to get serious about controlling the growth rate, in particular of large mandatory spending programs, which are crowding discretionary spending, which is where we do all investments in the future out of the budget, and ensuring that we no longer have a trajectory which is a headwind to the prospects of future prosperity for all Americans. So I appreciate the chance to be here today. Look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Warren, Senator Kennedy, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to offer testimony on the dangers of default and near default. It is an honor. Is the United States a nation with a political system that is so dysfunctional that it cannot pay the bills it is legally obligated to pay? That question is at the heart of the uncertainty around the debt ceiling. If the U.S. defaults on our bond obligations, many investors, international and national leaders, and citizens will answer that question in the affirmative. If the U.S. resorts to prioritizing bond payments while not meeting other financial obligations, many will answer in the affirmative. If the U.S. again runs up to the 11th hour, but raises or suspends the debt ceiling in the nick of time, some will still answer that question in the affirmative. The right answer to that question is no. Congress and the President need to answer that question clearly by raising or suspending the debt ceiling as soon as possible. Running up to the 11th hour before raising the debt ceiling would be a major economic and market event. On the day before a deal was reached during the 2011 debt ceiling standoff, the S&P 500 was down 6% from its high that year. 4 days later, credit rating agency Standard & Poor's downgraded the United States credit rating, sending stock prices tumbling further. At its low point during this episode, the S&P 500 lost around 15% of its value. The 2011 standoff sent economic confidence down to levels not seen since the 2008 global financial crisis. This matters because consumers' outlook for the economy has an effect on consumer spending. Even though a resolution was reached in 2011 in time for the U.S. not to miss any payments, the episode still drove up interest rates, costing taxpayers $1.3 billion in 2011, according to the $1.3 billion in 2011, according to the Government Accountability Office. The 10-year cost was estimated at around $19 billion. Running up to the 11th hour runs the risk of the U.S. accidentally missing payments. Accidents can happen. In the spring of 1979, Congress reached a debt ceiling deal at the last minute, but a subsequent computer glitch meant the Treasury was late in making payments on maturing securities to individual investors and in redeeming Treasury bills. That accident apparently warned investors that Treasury issues were not completely riskless. Economists estimate that this translated into a $12 billion annual increase in federal interest payments as the result of a 60 basis point permanent increase in interest rates. Actually missing a payment to a bondholder would have consequences that would be much more severe than occurred in 2011 or in 1979. The Dow would plunge by thousands of points per day, and the credibility of the United States, its trustworthiness as a country that pays its debts on time, would be substantially eroded. The beginnings of a global financial crisis would take hold as the riskiness of treasuries increased and market liquidity dried up. After a day or two of this chaos, a clean debt ceiling bill would pass both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support. So-called payment prioritization schemes would likely provoke a reaction similar to defaulting on U.S. debt obligations. The message Congress and the President would be sending to global markets would be that the U.S. government is unable to meet its spending obligations due to political dysfunction. That would shake confidence in the United States in a very fundamental way. To be sure, the U.S. has a debt problem. Increases in tax revenue are not sufficient to solve the U.S.'s debt problem. To solve the problem, projected spending will need to be cut. Specifically, projected future spending on entitlement programs will need to be cut. Ever higher debt and deficits gradually erode the ability of the U.S. economy to generate long-term increases in living standards. Government debt reduces private investment in productive capital. Lower investment translates into a smaller capital stock, lower rates of productivity growth, lower wages, output reductions, slower economic growth, and lower living standards. Higher deficits and debt also increase the borrowing costs facing the federal government and ultimately taxpayers. The vulnerability of the budget to changes in interest rates increases with higher debt levels, as does the amount of taxpayer money paid to foreign holders of U.S. debt. Rising debt could have other consequences as well. It could lead to a gradual decline in the value of U.S. assets, increase inflation expectations and actual inflation, and slowly erode confidence in the unique role of the U.S. dollar in global markets. This would make it more difficult to finance both private and public investment by U.S. entities. Ever higher debt also reduces the political space for important investments in basic research, physical infrastructure, and in programs to advance economic opportunity. Congress needs to tackle the debt, but waiting to raise the debt ceiling until the 11th hour is a risk that should not be required for prudent fiscal reform. Thank you.
Chair Warren, Ranking Member Kennedy, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. In my statement, I will address 3 main points. First, as others have stated, the debt limit should be raised without spending cuts or other conditions. Thank you. Families are struggling to pay bills, to care for themselves and their loved ones, and to afford the basics. Women, households of color, and families with low incomes are shouldering the heaviest burdens in the wake of the pandemic, and policymakers' continued failure to make public investments in childcare, paid leave, disability and aging care, affordable housing, and more. If the United States were to default on its obligations, working families would be devastated by the recession, high unemployment, and delay in receipt of government benefits that would result. These families can likewise ill afford cuts to federal programs and services upon which they rely. Accordingly, it is imperative to approve a clean extension of the debt ceiling without delay. Second, after raising the debt ceiling, Congress should make the tax code fairer and more progressive. Over the past 40 years, the tax code has become less progressive due to a series of costly tax cuts. While their proponents asserted that the wealthy and big corporations would share the benefits of these tax cuts with workers, this failed strategy has instead helped fuel extraordinary levels of wealth and income inequality, widened racial and gender wealth gaps, forestalled public investments, and increased the deficit. The 2017 tax law will reduce federal revenues by an estimated $1.6 trillion over a 10-year period, increasing the deficit by nearly $2 trillion. Notably, the benefits of the 2017 tax cuts failed to quote-unquote trickle down to workers or stimulate appreciable economic growth. Extending the expiring provisions of the 2017 tax law would reduce federal revenues by an additional estimated $2.2 trillion over 10 years, and increase the deficit by an additional estimated $3 trillion. It is time to reject this failed approach and chart a new path. There are numerous policy options that would make the tax code more progressive and foster an economy that works for all of us while raising significant federal revenues. For example, the 2017 tax law permanently slashed the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. One proposal from the Biden administration would increase the corporate rate to 28%, which would raise an estimated $1.3 trillion over 10 years. A proposed millionaire surtax, such as the one passed by the House of Representatives in 2021, would ensure those at the top who can afford to pay more in taxes do so. This proposal would raise an estimated $228 billion over 10 years. Billionaires pay an estimated effective tax rate of only 8% annually, in part because of preferential tax treatment of income from wealth. Raising the capital gains rate and closing the stepped-up basis loophole as proposed by the Biden administration would raise an estimated $174 billion over 10 years. President Biden's proposed billionaire minimum income tax, which would tax capital gains annually, is estimated to raise $361 billion over 10 years. And a wealth tax would curb excessive wealth and raise significant new revenues. For example, Senator Warren's ultramillionaires tax is estimated to raise up to $3 trillion over 10 years. This list is neither exhaustive nor comprehensive, but it does remind us that policymakers make a choice to increase the deficit at the expense of working families by failing to make the tax code more progressive. Third, policymakers should ensure the IRS has sufficient resources to enforce the tax laws already on the books. Every year, at least $450 billion in taxes, and likely more, is owed but not collected. Households in the top 1% of income are responsible for about a quarter of this tax gap. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 increased IRS funding by almost $80 billion over 10 years. The IRS has committed to use those resources to strengthen tax enforcement against the wealthiest. And Treasury has conservatively estimated that this funding would collect around $400 billion net over a 10-year period. Fully implementing the IRA's increased funding for the IRS will therefore help reduce the federal deficit. In sum, the path forward is clear. Congress should raise the debt ceiling without spending cuts or other conditions, raise additional revenues through more progressive tax policies, and protect IRS funding. This will not only reduce the deficit, but ensure that our economy lives up to its full potential and advance gender and racial equity, especially if additional revenues are used to make public investments in the care economy, affordable housing, and other infrastructure. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Ms. Matsui. I really appreciate it. Thank you all. So we're going to start with some questions now, and we're going to let Senator Van Hollen start if you're ready now. I recognize the senator for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for your testimony. We apologize for being a little late. There was a vote on, but I've been informed of your testimony and appreciate, I think, the broad consensus here. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, if I could start with you. I've respected some of the differences we've had over the years on budget issues, but I do appreciate the unity on this really important point, which is the United States cannot and must not default on its debt and violate the full faith and credit of the United States. You said in the past, nobody should ever contemplate willfully forcing the Treasury to default in this fashion. Anyone who does is unfit for any public office in the United States. Do you stand by that statement?
I do.
And there's been much talk this time around, as was true years ago, back in 2011, about the idea of prioritizing our debt. I know we reached out to you to get your views on prioritization of debt. And your response, I believe, was, quote, "It won't work and we will default. Other than that, it's a spiffy idea."
That's correct.
You stand by that?
I do.
Thank you. If I could just ask others on the panel, yes or no, do you agree with the assessment made by Dr. Holtz-Eakin on the question?
Meaning spiffy.
And it being spiffy. It being a bad idea, other than that, it's a spiffy idea. But you all agree that the idea of prioritization of the debt is a bad idea. Maybe we can start with Dr. Zandi.
Yes, I agree with that.
I prefer not to comment on that. It's really not my wheelhouse.
Okay.
Yes, Senator, I agree with that.
I agree, Senator.
Right. So this is the question because, this is one of these things you don't just come up to and jump over the cliff all at once. People advance these ideas to try to pretend there's a way to escape the ultimate question. Mr. Holtz, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, if you want to comment further on that, welcome.
Yeah, if I could. Right now, we're engaged in the so-called extraordinary measures, which amounts to temporarily reneging on promises we made to government employees and their pensions in order to fund things that we need to keep funding. That's a kind of prioritization. What do you do in prioritization? You say, okay, we'll do the treasuries, and then we'll do Social Security and Medicare, and we will stiff these guys. extraordinary measures, which amounts to temporarily reneging on promises we made to government employees and their pensions in order to fund things that we need to keep funding. That's a kind of prioritization. What do you do in prioritization? You say, okay, we'll do the treasuries, and then we'll do Social Security and Medicare, and we will stiff these guys. That's just emergency extraordinary measures by another name. You can't do it forever, and it doesn't solve any underlying problem. It just kicks the problem down the road temporarily. And that's putting aside, I think, they don't have the legal authority they have an obligation to fulfill all the promises that were made, and I don't think they can execute on it. But even if they could, and it was legal, it doesn't solve the basic problem.
Well, I appreciate that, and we've been trying to make that a point. I hope with your voices here today, we can amplify that very important point that it is tantamount at the end of the day to, as you say, defaulting on our debt. It's just a way to creep in, that people think they can creep into it. Let me just ask you all a simple yes or no question as well. I mean, if we defaulted on our debt, would it have catastrophic economic consequences for our country? Maybe start with Dr. Zandi.
Yeah, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that it would have a cataclysmic effects on the global financial system and on the economy, not only in the near term, but for generations to come. It'd be very costly.
I think I will answer that question based on everything I know. Yes, I agree.
Yes.
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 Right. So I think I am really glad that Senator Warren had this hearing, because I think clarity is really important at this moment, because there are lots of folks on Capitol Hill who think it's okay to play political games with the debt ceiling and try to impose their particular agenda and threaten to default on our national debt if they don't get their way on that agenda. If maybe just a final yes or no, if you all agree that that is a very, not just risky, but irresponsible strategy. Dr. Zandi?
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
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 I agree.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator
Thank
Van
you all for your
Hollen.
testimony.
So I want to see if we can look at another aspect of this. The House Republicans have decided to use the debt ceiling to hold our government and our economy hostage. They are demanding massive cuts in government spending, investments in the American economy, investments in American workers, or they won't allow the United States to pay the debts that it has already incurred. You know, a little like running up a bill on the credit card and then declaring that your new budget plan is, we're not going to pay the bill on the credit card. So you have all said uniformly, that's a terrible idea. We cannot default on our debt. But the Republicans, the MAGA Republicans in the House, have put us in this between a rock and a hard place. They said, okay, we will raise the debt ceiling, but only if you will agree to massive of the pain our nation is going through, but express confidence that by 2024, it will be, quote, much worse. So let's talk about what it would mean if those Republican cuts went through. Dr. Zandi, you're the chief economist at Moody's. I know you're testifying on your own behalf here, but you're the chief economist at Moody's and one of the authors of a new report that analyzes the impact on the economy from massive spending cuts being demanded by Republicans. So we've talked about what happens if there's breach. Now we're talking about these massive spending cuts. So let's start out. Tell us a little bit about the kinds of cuts we're talking about here.
Well, as you say, they're massive. First, I should say this is a bit opaque because it's not like the House Republicans have put forward a very explicit plan.
Fair
We're
enough.
kind of piecing this together and listening to what's being said in the House. And my sense is that they're proposing to so-called balance the budget 10 years from now through spending cuts. Taxes are off the table. And of course, Social Security and Medicare are also off the table. But if you do the arithmetic, and here I'm just doing simple arithmetic, it's $16 trillion in cumulative cuts over the 10-year period.
Okay.
So just divide by 10, that's 1.6 trillion per annum. That's 6% of GDP. That gives you a sense of context.
Okay, so $16 trillion over 10.
Oh, can I
that-
say, Senator, just a point of interest? I mean, maybe only economists would appreciate this, but that's a static estimate, right? That doesn't account for the economic consequences of those cuts on the economy and what that means for revenue spending. And so it's not going to be 16 trillion, it's going to be a much bigger number than 16 trillion. But let's just say 16
Okay, so
trillion.
those are in the straight cuts, just doing plain arithmetic on what the Republicans have said, without accounting for how much GDP goes down cumulatively in the middle of that. And just so everybody understands on this, is that the type of cut that the government could achieve by just not filling new job openings and doing a little belt tightening?
No. There's a number of ways you could get there, but the most, I guess, I hate to use the word reasonable way to get there would be you would have to effectively eliminate all non-defense discretionary spending, all the things that you were just mentioning earlier, housing, food inspection, everything related to transportation. You can see all the problems we're having in the airline, among the airlines and the rail, that would be affected. Housing, healthcare, science, NASA, everything, aid to overseas, it's just a long list of things. But also Medicaid. The Medicaid program would also have to be effectively eliminated to achieve that $16 trillion in cut over a 10-year period. So this is not just some jobs. This is, a lot of what I think American people expect from the American government. These are services that have been provided since the beginning of time, and they rely on them.
Okay. So when you take all that into account, that is the size of the cuts and the programs you'd have to cut to achieve a reduction in spending of that size, you've done an analysis of the impact on the economy. Can you tell us what that would do to the economy over the next decade?
Sure, and of course I'm making a lot of assumptions about timing and how this would be implemented and what exactly would be cut. But in the scenario that I articulate in gory detail in the paper that was released today, it would result in in the near term in a very severe recession. It'd be throughout 2024, so it'd be more than a year long. Just for context, the typical recession since World War II is 10 months, so this would be longer than that. The economy would lose 2.6 million jobs. The unemployment rate would rise to as high as 6%. So it would be it's not the financial crisis, but it would be a very meaningful hit to the economy in the near term. It would be a significant recession.
Okay, so in the near term, we're talking about a severe recession, and we're talking about loss of jobs?
2.6 million.
2.6
at the peak of the job loss.
At the peak
of the
would
job
be
loss.
what it looks like overall. And anything about what happens to GDP over this 10-year period?
Well, that was just the near term. So
Yes.
These are cuts through a 10-year period.
Right.
So let's take it out 10 years from now, the end of the budget horizon in 2023. The GDP, that's the value of all the things that we produce, all the goods and services we produce, would be 2.8% less than it would have been if we just did a clean debt limit increase and there would be no impact on the economy. So that's the counterfactual. And just for a little bit of context there, I think you said that in your opening remarks, but just to strike that
Which
point
I'd
home.
gotten from your report.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
That's why they sound.
I thought you did. I thought you did the arithmetic yourself. But that's a little more than a kind of a typical year of GDP growth. It's as if the economy could have stood still. Of those 10 years, one of those years it just stood still. So quite significant. And employment would still be roughly a million, not quite a million, less than it would have been in the counterfactual with a clean debt limit increase.
Okay, so let me just push this on through. So we're talking about 2.6 million jobs lost in the near term, 1 million over time. 10 years out, we'd be down 1 million jobs.
It's just taking two different points in time. At
Right.
the maximal impact in the near term, it's 2.6 million. By the end of the 10-year horizon, I think you're down 950K, something like that. But
Yep.
yeah, close to a million.
So when you take all that into account, I think I've got my thing here. What we're looking at is the Republicans can either, these House Republicans, can either throw us into an immediate recession and cost us about 1 million jobs in the short term if they do a debt default. But if instead we cave in and go with the kinds of cuts they're talking about, we get a severe recession, we get about 2.5 million jobs lost in the near term, and 1 million jobs kind of over time, year by year, off into the future. So this sounds like they've really got us caught where the Republicans are trying to drive this. On the one hand, we don't want to see a debt default, but on the other, I think what you're telling us is the consequences of the kinds of cuts that the Republicans are advancing would also have a severe impact on the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward that, you know, defaulting on the debt, as we all have discussed, is cataclysmic, depending on just how cataclysmic depends on exactly what scenario unfolds. But the alternative of engaging in these massive cuts in spending over this 10-year horizon would also be, you know, quite devastating, you know, to the economy. You know, it's there's neither is a, you know, I think a viable option.
Good. I appreciate that. And I think that takes us back to where we started with all 5 of you, and that is we need to raise the debt ceiling without conditions. Thank you. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I often think in my role as the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee about America's role in the world and what it means and what it and the benefits. It has great burdens, but it also has benefits along the way. And for decades, the United States has been the leader in the global financial system. About half of international trade is invoiced in dollars. About half of all international loans and debt securities are denominated in dollars. And dollars are involved in nearly 90% of all foreign exchange transactions. And that has been an immeasurable asset to the American economy and our foreign policy goals. It allows American consumers to borrow more cheaply for a house or car. It allows the U.S. government to use economic sanctions to change other countries' behavior and ultimately try to avoid military conflict. But that could all change if we were to default on our debt. So, Dr. Zandi and Dr. Holmes-Aiken, how would defaulting on the debt harm the United States' position as the dominant reserve currency?
It would severely undermine it, and I don't think we can overstate the importance of being the reserve currency on the planet. Particularly, I think people don't recognize how important this is in times of crises, because we have global crises, and in those periods of time, because the United States is the AAA credit on the planet, because everyone believes that if they invest in a U.S. Treasury bond that they will be paid in a timely way, money comes here, capital comes here, and that is an enormous benefit to our economy at the worst of economic times. So the reserve currency status provides enormous benefits to us. And as you said, there are responsibilities, but there are enormous benefits to that, and that would be significantly diminished because we're no longer money good. You know, investors, global investors don't know for sure that they're going to get their money back if they invest in the United States of America, and they're going to invest somewhere else. And it diminishes us geopolitically as well when you think about it. You know, think about the importance of the reserve currency status when Russia invaded Ukraine and what we did to sanction Russia. The first thing we did was freeze the dollar reserves of, you know, the Russians' dollar reserves. We wouldn't be able to do that in a world where, you know, we're no longer the reserve currency. And then it also reduces and diminishes our status geopolitically, economically with China. I mean, China is a formidable competitor, and it's increasingly found in reserve portfolios across the world, and this is increasing over time, and that would significantly be accelerated if the U.S. Abdicated its role as, and that's what we'd be doing. We'd be abdicating our role as a reserve currency. So it would be, these are things I'm not even counting for in the kind of the analysis that I did that are so difficult to quantify, but they are critically important to our success, both economically and geopolitically.
So I agree with everything that Mark said, and I just want to just pick up on the last point. The world benefits from having a reserve currency. Because those transactions can be done in a common currency, they're cheaper, more efficient, global trading and investment flows more smoothly, and all economies benefit from that. So the notion that we could give up the creditworthiness of the treasuries and have the world stand by and not go find another reserve currency is missing the big point. It would, and we would be handing that opportunity to China. And at this juncture, there's no reason to do that.
Yeah, you've both made the case that I'm concerned about. We already see China trying to do this in a variety of ways, and that's without defaulting on our debt. We see them in the context of trying to create a digital reserve as well. They're out there to challenge us in every dimension. And just one final point to add a fine point to this question. If we were to default, and God forbid that we do, would it be easy to put the genie back in the bottle and convince others in the world, don't worry, that happened once, it won't happen again?
Would you be convinced? I mean, no. I mean, it's just not possible.
I'm not easy to convince generally. But
yeah, no, it's not possible. I mean, investors, since the founding of the nation, this was a principle that we established. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, bought back U.S. The Revolutionary War debt on pennies on the dollar to establish the credit of the United States, that we are money good. You put your money with us, you're good. And if we, so as just 1 second go over the line and not pay in a timely way, we lose that forever. And it's incalculable, the cost, because you add just a few basis points to interest rates, and it's going to be more than that. Just add a few basis points on $31 trillion in debt. Just think about that for a second. The cost that we were going to incur. We're going to be shelling out cash to Japanese bond investors, Chinese bond investors, British bond investors, instead of investing in our schools and Head Start, in our military, and all the things that we all can agree on as Americans that we need to do.
Just to drive the point home, revisit the opening statement that Michael Strain gave. I mean, in 2011, we didn't default, but we still incurred enormous costs. We got downgraded, and it took years to repair that. Now imagine actually defaulting.
Yeah, that global leadership makes for a more secure domestic financial system and advances U.S. interests at home and abroad. I appreciate your answer to that. May I have, if you have the time? My friends often talk about that we need to deal with the question on spending cuts, but they've depleted the revenue side of the ledger over the last several years. Dr. Zandi, how much did the 2017 Republican tax law add to the federal deficit over 10 years?
I'm using CBO numbers here, but it will add $2 trillion over the 10-year period, give or take.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we want to have an honest discussion, I think we have to look at all sides of the ledger at the end of the day. And it seems to me that the time to do those things is when you're talking about budgets, not when the time comes due on your debt. Finally, last year, Congress appropriated, for example, $8 billion to the Child Care and Block Development Grant, CCDBG. This is the main federal program that provides funding for child care, providers to support low-income families in accessing affordable child care. I've heard from child care providers throughout New Jersey who conveyed that this funding has been critical to their survival in what is an incredibly low-margin industry. So I would ask Ms. Weisenfreund and Ms. Matsui, what would be the impact on families and child care providers if there is an insistence on slashing vital discretionary funding like the CDBG as a precondition to avoiding a debt default?
Our program is funded by about 85% federal money. And in our program, if there was that kind of cut, we would have to most of our children would lose services to care. Most of our most vulnerable children and families. It would really break the system that we've so intentionally built to support the poorest and most vulnerable children and families in our Western Mass service area. It would be tragic.
Ms. Mitsui?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and I appreciate the expertise of my colleague on the panel. I will just add that losing that level of services and childcare supports will not only devastate the childcare sector, the workers who are employed in childcare, but also the parents and families and the employers and the economy writ large who rely on caregiving in order for the economy to function. We saw the devastation during the pandemic, and those effects would certainly be replicated, if not exacerbated, because of the weakened state of childcare right now.
Yeah, we want people to work. We have 11 million jobs that are going unfulfilled in terms of human capital to do so, and yet we would potentially take away one of the essential elements of helping people get to work so that they can be gainfully productive, both for themselves, their families, and our society. So it's one example of which this type of thinking doesn't make sense. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. In fact, bear with me just a little because I want to go back and see if we can dig a little deeper on this question around childcare. So our earlier discussion talked about how these extremist House Republicans are demanding massive across-the-board spending cuts. And if defense is off the board, veterans are off the board, Social Security is off the board, and Medicare is off the board, as some Republicans now claim, then the other programs at a minimum, I'm kind of like you are here, Dr. Zandi, it's just math. You've got to cut the other programs by about 78%, or else just wipe out entire programs. And as the new Moody's analysis shows, if Republicans get their way, this is going to be about 2.6 million Americans who lose their jobs. So I want to just do the translation about the different ways that people lose their jobs under this, using childcare and early childhood education as part of our example. So I'm a big fan of early childhood education. It expands learning opportunities for our babies. It gives mamas and daddies an opportunity to go to work. The United States has been underinvesting in childcare for decades. Of the 37 richest nations in the world, the United States is number 35 in terms of our spending on little ones. And we need to be investing a lot more in childcare to grow our economy. But these MAGA House Republicans are threatening to cut the little bit of funding that we do have going into childcare. So, Ms. Weissenfreud, you run this Head Start Center and early learning program in Franklin, Massachusetts, and Western Hampton counties in Massachusetts. How many employees do you have, and how many children do you serve?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So when fully staffed, we employ 168 people, and we're funded to serve 438 children. 120 of those are pregnant women, infants, and toddlers, and 318 preschoolers. You know, because of these chronic structural economic issues we've been talking about, and the pandemic has certainly worsened this, our program, like many others, is struggling to recruit staff.
All right. So just so everyone understands, not everyone knows about Hampton counties and Franklin and this area. Can you just describe the area a little bit? Are you in an urban area?
Yeah, so no, we I run a pretty large program, mostly rural, some semi-rural. We span 1,600 square miles.
Okay, so you are the child care provider for 1,600 square mile
We're
area.
a big one, from the border of Vermont down to the border of Connecticut.
You're the big one. All right, so it sounds like things are already pretty tough on your current budget.
That's right.
Head Start is a federal program that provides funding to help low-income families afford child care. Is it fair to say that this federal funding is a large part of your budget?
Oh, yes, it's about 85% of our
Okay,
budget.
so 85%. I want you to imagine if your federal funding is cut by 78%, can you keep your centers open and retain your current employees?
You know, I hope I never have to do that math.
But if you do,
Well, it'll be a huge impact to our operations. As I said, we have 168 employees. We operate 11 sites. 28 classrooms over this rural area. So a 78% cut, we would be serving fewer than 100 children, and we would probably have to reduce to 1 or 2 centers. I would have to lay off about 130 staff, I would say.
All right. So there's the example of what happens if we make these federal cuts. The childcare sector is already short about 60,000 employees compared just to pre-pandemic, when we were already hearing from parents all across this country that they could not find safe, affordable, accessible childcare. And if all of the childcare providers face the kinds of cuts that these MAGA Republicans are proposing, then more childcare workers all across the country will lose their jobs and more of these childcare centers will close. So let me do another part of this. If you cut the number of employees that you have by 130, what's going to happen to the children you serve? Can you estimate how many families would lose their child care because of those cuts?
Well, again, just doing the arithmetic here, so about 341 of the most vulnerable children and their families would lose care, and that would have both short-term and longer-term impacts, right? So in the short term, if we cut 130 staff, these youngest children would lose access to quality early education and care, to nutritious meals and snacks, screenings, referrals, health and mental health supports, all the things I spoke about earlier, and lose their critical relationships with teachers. We know that Head Start is a fantastic long-term investment in terms of child welfare, as well as high school and college graduation, and of course, participation in the workforce.
So I'm just trying to think through what this means in terms of job losses. So we cut the federal budget the way the Republicans have proposed. You lay off 168 of your staff. In turn, that means that more than half the children you serve, the doors are locked. They can't come. And what happens to their parents?
Well, over 70% of our families work. They go to school or attend school readiness programs. So clearly, if they were to lose childcare, most of those families would lose jobs, would lose income, would have to leave school, would have to leave job readiness programs to take care of their children, with single adult households being most affected. So this would lead to immediate loss of income and thrust them into even deeper poverty.
So the job cuts lead to more job cuts in your case. Are there other childcare options near you?
So we're the largest provider of subsidized care in the rural part of our service area. There are a few providers in Western Mass, but we also have the most expensive market for private pay. It'll cost about $21,000 a year for infant care, and most of our families do live at the federal poverty level. So there's no way that the 341 children who would lose services could be absorbed by other providers in the area.
So let me just say, thank you, Ms. Weissenfreud, for the work you do. Thank you for the way that you play a critical role in keeping our economy going and letting families build a strong economic future.
And may I say one thing?
Please.
Thank you for calling the children little people. Because they are people.
Yes, they are.
Thank you.
Yes, they are. They don't have lobbyists, but they are people.
That's right.
That's an important distinction around
I
here.
appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. But thank you very much for your work, and thank you for helping illustrate what happens here. If we can, then, I'd like to turn to one more topic. I'm going to call on myself again since Senator Kennedy hasn't made it back from voting, and that is to talk about revenues. I think it's fair to ask, and I think Dr. Holtz can raise this, how the national debt got so large. MAGA Republicans claim it's about spending too much on child care and air traffic controllers, but there are two sides to any balance sheet, and MAGA Republicans have conveniently ignored their own actions in driving up the national debt by shoveling tax breaks to the richest Americans and the largest corporations. Year after year, the Republican playbook has been simple: more help for their rich buddies and more economic pain for everyone else. Today, billionaires pay just 3% of their wealth each year in federal income taxes, less than half the rate that 99% of America pays. Giant corporations have lobbied their way from paying 6% of the cost of running our country to paying about 1% of the cost of running our country. So serious conversations about reducing the national debt should start with rebalancing our tax system, not start with how to hurt families. So I want to talk about some of those ideas. First, repealing the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy and for giant corporations. Ms. Matsui, you're a tax expert. That's why we invited you here today. So how much would it affect the deficit if we repealed the Trump tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and the largest corporations?
Thank you, Senator. Just to discuss two provisions that were in President Biden's budget last year to even partially repeal or bring down raise the corporate tax rate, as well as repeal the tax cut for the highest individual income tax rate, would raise $1.3 trillion over 10 years and almost $187 billion over 10 years, respectively, and those revenues could be used to reduce the deficit.
Okay, and this is for the largest corporations and the wealthiest individuals,
The
right?
highest individual.
Okay, and Ms. Weissenfreud, you're going to help me out here on the other half of this. You run an early learning and child care program. Would it increase your taxes if we reverse the Trump tax cuts for people making over $500,000 in a single year?
Oh, no.
Would it increase the taxes of your workers?
No again.
Would it increase the taxes of the families that you serve?
Definitely not.
Okay, so nobody in your outfit's making more than $500,000 a year?
No, Senator.
Okay. Dr. Zandi, as an economist, how do you think about repealing the Trump tax cuts for people earning over, say, $500,000? How would that affect the U.S. economy? Would it cost us 2.6 million jobs the way the House Republican cuts would?
No, I think the negative consequences would be on the margin. And I base that on looking at the effects of the tax cuts. I mean, the cuts were put forward as a way to significantly increase economic activity. And I think the research that's been done since that time has found that indeed it has not done that. Admittedly, we need more data points, and the pandemic has made it difficult to disentangle all the things that are going on. But research from the IMF, research from Brookings has shown that the benefit of the tax cuts are relatively small. Therefore, I think the negative impact of the tax increases will be on the margin relatively small. The final thing I'll say is when we were all debating and discussing the TCJA cuts and CBO weighed in, you can go back and look at those studies. They found that based on all the research that they were doing, that the benefits of those tax cuts would be on the margin, and it looks like that's exactly what we got.
That's right.
On the margin.
On the margin, meaning very small.
Very, very small. I mean, all else being equal, if you raise taxes, it's going to have some negative consequence, but it's on the margin. It's on the margin.
Okay, which means you could raise them here, not going to have a big effect.
No,
Okay.
not a big effect.
All right, so there's one option that we're talking about. $1 trillion is roll back the Trump tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. Here's another. Tax the profits that giant multinational corporations hide overseas right now, helping level the playing field for domestic businesses and joining Europe and others in enacting a global corporate minimum tax. Ms. Matsui, how much revenue would that raise?
Senator, for example, Senator Sanders' Corporate Tax Dodging Protection Act would raise an estimated $1 trillion over 10 years.
Okay, so there's a second $1 trillion that we've got. Ms. Weissenfreud, are you or any of your workers or any of the families whose children you care for giant multinationals who would pay this additional tax on international profits?
No, Senator Warren.
Okay. And Dr. Zandi, would this have a meaningful effect on the U.S. economy?
No, I think it'd have a very small marginal impact on the economy.
Okay, so there's a second option, an international corporate minimum that would shut down tax havens. Let's do a third one. We should ask billionaires to pay taxes on their growing piles of wealth through proposals like my ultra-millionaire tax or President Biden's billionaire minimum income tax. Ms. Matsui, How much money would that raise?
President Biden's proposal would raise about $361 billion over 10 years, and your ultramillionaires tax is estimated to raise up to $3 trillion over 10 years.
Okay, so somewhere in that range, between $360 billion and $3 trillion. Ms. Weissenfreud, just checking, you, your employees, your families, are any of you secret billionaires who would pay this tax, either President Biden's tax or my 2-cent wealth tax?
No, we're not.
Okay, and Dr. Zandy, one more time.
Yep, on the margin.
On the margin.
Yep.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you to all of you on this. There are just 3 proposals, and we could raise somewhere around $5 trillion without costing the economy 2.6 million jobs and without increasing the burden on workers and families by a single penny. And we could make the tax system a whole lot fairer as part of what we're doing here. House Republicans want to talk about the national debt, and I am happy to talk about the national debt, but let's be clear. This is a question of who pays for running our government. Responsible lawmakers should flat out refuse to cut a single dollar of investments for the 99% of Americans, while the top 1% are getting away without paying their fair share. And if Republicans really care about the national debt, I'd be happy to work with them to make sure that billionaires and giant corporations are pitching in just like everyone else. And with that, I understand that we are not going to have Senator Kennedy back. Is that right? We have run him off. No, we haven't. So let me just wrap this up. Look, I think it's clear that House Republicans are not interested in fiscal responsibility. They want hardworking Americans to shoulder the burden of keeping the government up and running, while billionaires and large corporations get away with paying as little as possible. The debt ceiling hostage demands that they're making would shrink our economy, and it would cost millions of Americans their jobs while it plunges us into a recession. That is a non-starter. Responsible lawmakers, as Dr. Holtz-Eakin has said, should reject this extremist ultimatum and instead act immediately to raise the debt ceiling. And I'm glad to see we have unanimity on that point today. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. I want to thank you all for your testimony. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, they will be due 1 week from today. That's Tuesday, March 14th. And for our witnesses, will have 45 days to respond to any questions. Thank you all again for doing this. We really appreciate it. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.